Hello, everybody. Hello, YouTube. Uh, I thought I'd make a video today about Alex Jones. Alex Jones is an Australian broadcaster, commentator, journalist, whatever you want to call him, who was today, I believe, arrested, um, and he's been charged in Sydney for um, sexual assault. Um, SA, as some people say. And I hope that YouTube don't tell me off for that, but that's what he's been accused of doing, and he's been charged. So it's not just a accusation. The accusation started a couple of months ago, maybe, and now it's got to the stage of charging. So the basis of the case, all that we know so far, at least all that I know, is that I believe it's three men who, sometime in the past 20 years, alleged that Alex Jones assaulted them. I believe they're talking about sexual harassment rather than actual penetration, but I'm not sure. So certainly there's been something happen, and these are men, not women, and these are adults, not children. So we're talking about an adult case, not a child case. So I wanted to give some thoughts about this at the early stage, and also because I have worked, had about 8 years of working in the legal sector, and I came across some general knowledge about that is different to what most people believe. So the common belief is that, well, if you remember the believe all women claim, every woman who ever makes an accusation along those lines is telling the truth. Everybody who's found guilty is guilty. Everybody who is accused is guilty, and a lot of other people who are not accused are also guilty. That's the claim. That is in reality, that is the general claim. Now, I want to just dispute that, and I'll give some evidence as to why that's wrong. So the first part of this is that the higher the level of penalty, the more people lie, and there's a reason for this. So when you have a high penalty, you know that you can hurt whoever you don't like with that penalty. Um, so in Australia, the highest penalty is for murder. So we see a lot of people lie a lot about murder cases, and they lie. They set people up. They frame them for what are accidental deaths or murders by other people because they don't like them. And in fact, a common thing is to murder someone you don't like and then blame it on someone else you don't like and set them up, frame them for the murder that you committed. And there's other kinds of setups, and there's whole movies and everything about murder. But the next level down, at least in Australia, by Australian law, is sexual assault of the various different kinds, both adults and children. And so in Australia, murder gets about 20 years, and sexual assaults get usually 10 to 15 years. Now, manslaughter, that's another thing, but it's the same general feeling as manslaughter, as murder, but not quite as serious. And then there's other things like vehicular manslaughter and all sorts of things like that. So people don't realise that the second most lied about thing is sexual assault, at least in Australia. And this is because of the level of penalty. So if you followed any kind of murder mystery, you'd know, and they're actually reasonably accurate in this respect, that how they're presented when the accusations are first made and the police first do, is usually pretty inaccurate because it's pretty rare that police go there and go, "Oh, did you murder them? Yeah, I did. Oh, okay, no worries." And that does sometimes happen, but sometimes also you get false confessions and so forth. But it's quite common that they think that one person's done it, but actually it was someone else, or sometimes they don't even know who did it, and so forth. And sometimes they'll have people put in jail for murders that the person's still alive. Sometimes you'll get them, they'll be put in jail for murders that um, they were accidents. They just died by accident, and sometimes it was self-inflicted. And some people have even set up somebody for murder by killing themselves. It's been known to happen. There's been all sorts of different things. You'll get parents will confess to murders that they believe their children have done, and even frame themselves to help their children get away with it. And then sometimes the children didn't do it in the first place, someone else. And there's all sorts of different ways that it goes about. Sometimes even people genuinely believe someone they didn't like did it, but it was actually someone else that they don't even know about or don't know or didn't suspect and so forth. the same sorts of things happen with sexual assault cases. And one of the main differences is it's not quite as much. So there's not quite as much lying, and it's proportionate to the amount of penalty. So again, 10 and 15 years versus 20 years. So you're getting about half as much or three quarters as much lying. It is proportional. But one big thing is that in sexual assault cases, there's often a paucity of evidence. So they often don't have very much evidence. So sometimes they don't even have evidence that anything's happened. So, I was saying in murder cases where you might not have a body and you might not be sure that they're dead. Um, and there's been cases where people have been found guilty of murder and sentenced to 20 years when no one actually, there was no murder and the person turns up alive later on. That can happen. And that's essentially, that's the norm for sexual assault cases is that it's very unusual that you get physical evidence. Sometimes you do. Sometimes you'll have physical evidence that there was sex. But even if you have physical evidence that there was sex, it's very difficult to have physical evidence that it was forced. Sometimes you do get videotapes, but that's very rare. The most common suggestion is that at most you will have, and I think it's something like 10% of cases where you actually have physical evidence of sex, and it's something like 1% where you'll have physical evidence of force. So most of the time, it's their word, it's usually his word against hers or her word against his. And that becomes quite dangerous because, whilst this is a serious crime, and we've recognised that in the law by having this serious penalty, it's dangerous when it's difficult to prove, and because it can change people's lives so much. Now, my experience in the criminal justice system does have. I was mostly with the statistical side of things, and I could tell you that most cases that go to a police station are false. Now, police will often disregard it when it becomes obvious it's false. Now, about half of the ones that go to a police station will go further to the law courts. So half are dismissed by police as false. Now, you might say, oh, well, that's just because police don't know what they're doing. Now, I can tell you what kinds of cases they dismiss because I've been involved at that level and I know just how absurd some of them are. And the kind of cases that police dismiss, because it's not the police officer's job to dismiss cases. They, in fact, are in most cases required to present them if there's any possibility of any level of truth of them. But the cases that the police would dismiss would be ones that, well, you might have ones where the person wasn't even in the vicinity, wasn't even in the state, wasn't even in the country. And, you know, there were cases where the person's still a virgin. It's cases where somebody is physically incapable of doing it. Um, you'll get ones that are just absolutely absurd. You even get ones where someone was dead before the incident happened and they're still accused of it. And you're like, but they were dead. And, and then, of course, they'll investigate it. They'll say, well, maybe somebody else did it. And there was, and what they look for evidence that it happened and also evidence that it didn't happen and possibilities of this and so forth. So evidence that it did happen, obviously, if there was evidence of sex, which again, it's very unusual to get that, that would be evidence that it did happen. So if there's evidence of sex, they'll usually go ahead with it. They'll go ahead to the next level, which is go to the prosecutor's office. Um, but if there's no evidence of that, they still might. If there's evidence, maybe there's a videotape of them being in the same area, so there's a chance that there was sex and so forth. And then on the other hand, they also would be looking for evidence that it didn't happen. So evidence that didn't happen would be things like you've got a reason to make it up. But just because you've got a reason to make it up doesn't mean you are. But there are cases where it's very seriously likely that you're making it up, um, and sometimes they won't go ahead with them. So celebrity is one. Another one that's probably more worse than celebrities is where there's a child custody dispute. So, for example, when you have a lot of child abuse claims, if they're raised by the mother against the father, and there's a child custody dispute in relation to it, that's a red flag. Now, it's not a guarantee because sometimes fathers do things to their children, even when they're in a child custody dispute. Sometimes they do. It's but the amount of times they're accused of doing it versus the amount of times they do it, there's a big gap because you've got a reason to lie, and your big reason is you want custody of the children. So you want the children, and you also want the financial benefits of that because they'll have to pay maintenance, the father will, and also um, you might even get control of their property. You might get to steal their house and take possession of it, and all sorts of things like that. So there's a big reason to lie. Now that doesn't mean that it couldn't have happened because it could have, because we know that sometimes fathers do hurt their children. But we also know that mothers sometimes hurt their children too, and that children can be convinced to lie and so forth. So there's all those different things they have to take into account. So because of that, half of them, around about half, are dismissed at the police stage. And then you even have the ones that they claim it happened, but they don't even go to police. Now, I know there are cases where there are people who will swear till they're blue in the face that it did happen, but they didn't go to police because they thought they wouldn't be believed. But I also know that some of those people are making it up, and I don't know the proportions because they're not tested. So you get a certain degree of testing by the police. You get a more thorough and rigorous testing in the law courts. Now, if you're not even going to them, now there may be a reason. Maybe you're scared, but maybe you don't want to hurt the family if it's a family member. But there's also a big reason could be that you're making the whole thing up. And now we also have to realise that there is also the mental issues. So some people, and we used to say some other reasons, but some people honestly believe that something happened but it didn't. Not because they're lying, but because they have a mental health issue that either some diagnosis or just a situation that leads to them not being in touch with what's really happening. Now, when we get to the celebrity cases, this is where it becomes particularly interesting because in sexual assault cases, to combat all of this lying, they, as a standard, will suppress the names and identities and anything that can identify the person that's being accused and the accuser. And of course, if they do that, now people think, oh, they do it to protect the accuser, but they also do it to protect the accused because it's quite common for people to do this aiming to hurt someone's credibility and it hurts their reputation. And you may know that even when you're found not guilty of these sorts of things, it still affects your reputation for the rest of your life. Like Michael Jackson, for example, now he's dead now. He was twice accused of hurting children. Once he had an out of court settlement, and the other time it went to trial and he was found not guilty. When he died, the majority of people thought that he was guilty. Now, I didn't really follow that case, but I can say that people just disregarded the facts. Now, we also have, well, we have lots of cases. We have people that are that are accused. We had Johnny Depp. You know, he was accused. Now that was against an adult woman, but he was accused. Didn't even go to court. Went to a civil trial instead, so not a criminal trial. He was found guilty of not being defamed, and then was found guilty of being defamed in the same case. So, and he's proved it to such high levels, and yet still a lot of people think that he did do something terrible. And he wasn't accused of sexual assault; he was accused of domestic violence. And of course, there's a significant degree of evidence that he was actually abused himself and wasn't the abuser. So, um, you get all these cases, and that's why we suppress it. So the very fact that we know it's Alex Jones already makes this an unfair case on him. Um, but that's not to say that celebrities can't do this because it is possible. The Jeffrey Epstein case was one where we know with no doubt whatsoever that he was guilty of these things and also was inviting other celebrities to do these things. And there's sort of two ways of looking at it. One is that, well, celebrities with their power can do whatever they like. And the other way of looking at it is that celebrities, by having power, can be blackmailed. And a lot of these sorts of cases are sort of blackmail cases where they're particularly against celebrities, but even if they're not celebrities, you know, there's been cases where it's against a school teacher, for example, and their student, the real reason why they made the false accusations up was because they got failed for something, or even that they had a crush on the teacher and the teacher rejected them, so they said, "Oh, well, you rejected me, I'm going to do this to you." So it doesn't need you to be a celebrity, but if you are a celebrity, it becomes worse. So um, the fact that we know his name and we don't know the names of his accusers is fundamentally unfair. We should know both. But even if we did know both, that would also be unfair. And, there's all sorts of issues there. But the fact that they're men and not children does make it more likely. But the fact that it's anywhere over the last 20 years makes it less likely. Now, mate, we might get specifics, but we might not. And yeah, I mean, I look at the case of Cardinal George Pell, for example, where we did get specifics. And if you looked at the specifics, there was no possibility that he was guilty. And he won on appeal, which was correct. And the only reason he lost was because it was a bad decision by the jury that they ignored that evidence. And the thing is that the media in that case also ignored the evidence. And a lot of people, he died, I believe he's dead. He died with people thinking that he was guilty when there was significant evidence that he wasn't. And in fact, it was impossible. But the other thing is with celebrity cases, and you may not know this about prosecutors' offices, they're required to prosecute if it's in the public interest. So they'll be required to prosecute for celebrity cases, even if they know they're not guilty, because the public want to know. So if it was someone that wasn't a celebrity, they wouldn't bother if there wasn't enough evidence. But so they do go ahead with a lot of cases where they know that they're not guilty because they're celebrities, because people want to know, because that's one of the responsibilities. They're not doing anything wrong by doing that. This is part of the role of the prosecutor's office. So they're going ahead with that. So I wanted to sort of look, so without knowing any of the facts of the case, really beyond this very basic thing. Firstly, the media, with all criminal trials, are extremely inaccurate. They will, they won't necessarily say, oh, everybody's guilty when they're not. Sometimes they say people are not guilty when they are. They have decided in their head, depending on which newspaper it is, which journalist it is, whatever, they've decided what the fact is. And then they ignore the evidence and just focus around whatever the fact is. So we can largely ignore what the media says. And even in fact, when you get a conclusion, they'll still get it wrong. They'll still just say whatever the heck they want to say. So we need to really be careful when we listen to that. If we were someone in the law courts and we had all the evidence from either side, prosecution or defence or anyone reporting on it, you'd have the evidence and then you could make a fair assessment. Now again with Cardinal George Pell, we got that evidence. And so I feel like I could make a fair assessment because I had that evidence. I didn't have it for cases like, for example, Bill Cosby or Michael Jackson. I didn't have that evidence because it wasn't available. So I don't think I could have ever given a fair response to that. All I could do was look at the statistics. Now, again, from what I'm aware, there was the Hey Dad guy, fairly confident that he was guilty. And some people are saying that with the Puff Daddy or P. Diddy case, that's what a case that he is guilty. That may well be true, and it does look like that is true. But generally speaking, these ones are not likely to be true because people have that added reason to want to lie about them because they're getting fame and celebrity out of it. Plus, they're hurting a celebrity. Now, Alan Jones, not Alex Jones, it's a different guy. Alan Jones, the Australian. Alex Jones is the conspiracy theory guy, but Alan Jones has been in a lot of trouble. He's been sued for all sorts of things. People have accused him of all sorts of things. That a lot of people hate him. People he doesn't know, and so they could make false accusations based on them not liking some of the things he said and some of the stances he's taken. And apparently, these three men, I believe, worked for him. Now, that doesn't mean that they didn't hate some aspect of him. And they could well hate him so much they want him to die, want him to rot in jail and all that. But that doesn't mean that he actually hurt them. So they have a reason to hate him, but not that, is beyond him physically hurting them. And you have to sort of differentiate it between, are they doing this because they hate him for something he said to them or some opinion he has about something or other, whether it's racist, sexist, whatever it might be, or are they hating him because he actually hurt them? Now, again, statistically, it's unlikely that he hurt them from this perspective. And the fact that there's three of them doesn't make it more likely than if there was one. I know some people think, well, it should. The more accusers, the more likely it is. But if it's false, and if they're doing it for money or fame or to hurt him, the number can actually make it less likely to be true. So if you have more accusers, it can be less likely because I know we don't really think that way, but that's can be the reality. Because if they're conspiring and let's say that because they will get if he's found guilty, they'll have interviews out of this. Even if they're anonymous at the moment, they can throw away that anonymity. They're allowed to at any stage, and they will just go onto the news and they'll get paid and they'll get lots of money. And even if he's found not guilty, they'll still get their money. So they have an incentive, a financial incentive, as well as potentially a vindictiveness incentive to do it. That doesn't mean that he couldn't possibly have done it. He might have, but and look, I'd hope that the police have investigated thoroughly. But also, I know that the police would be instructed that they have to prosecute people that are potentially not guilty because it's in the public interest. So they're not doing anything wrong by prosecuting him, but that also doesn't mean that he's done anything wrong. I mean, there was that case of Russell Brand, who I assume he was been dropped because nothing has been heard from it. But that was more because he was peddling in conspiracy theories and so forth. So the people often have a reason to go after someone that is not the reason that or has nothing to do with what they're being accused of. Um, now, again, as we get more evidence, it is possible, obviously, until we've heard, I haven't even heard the evidence, so I don't know. It is possible that he's done something. But, my thought, my gut feeling is that he's probably not guilty. You never know. Just the way it's gone about, and I certainly haven't noticed him do anything that would suggest this. But I don't really know him. I've never met the guy. I mean, he's in Sydney. I'm not in Sydney. I'm in Melbourne. So I don't really have much to do with him except for just briefly on Sky News. I heard a couple of things, and I barely watched Sky News a couple of times, and so probably heard from him 6 or 7 times. All I know of him is that he's very smart, and apparently he's controversial. He doesn't sound controversial. Like what I've heard of him didn't sound controversial, but apparently he is. And so, yeah, he's apparently on conservative, so he's on the right side of politics as opposed to the left, not as opposed to the wrong. And so there are some people that like to accuse people who are on the right side of politics, who are right winged, of being guilty of things, and that's pretty much what's happening at the moment. And so whether that is a part of this or whether it's more something else, I don't know. The chances of him doing something at this stage seem pretty unlikely, and I want to just compare it with the Hey Dad guy. So the Hey Dad guy was accused by his co-worker on Hey Dad. So she was also a celebrity. She was a child at the time, and they worked together. He had a lot of time to do it, a lot of opportunities, and he was playing her father on the show, and he was a father figure in a lot of ways. So there was a lot of that part of things, and also, she took a while to come forward, but she did partially come forward at the time. It all added up. And I completely believe that he was guilty. He was found guilty. And the P Diddy one, so from what I know, obviously I knew the Puff Daddy's parties, and I knew that they were severe. And a lot of the accusers are celebrities who were at the parties. Now, that doesn't mean that he's guilty, but a lot of the evidence does suggest that he might be. Now, he might not be. I'm not 100% convinced about Puff Daddy, but it looks plausible. Um, and because a lot of things are lining up. Now, this case, maybe as it progresses, we'll find that it was likely, but it's not looking like it at the moment, but that doesn't mean that it won't look like it later on. So I just wanted, and the purpose of this video is because a lot of people do misunderstand this kind of case and they just assume that everybody who's accused is guilty. Um, I don't think that's fair to put that in there. And one thing I wanted to compare it to is like in Australia, drugs are pretty much legal. And when you're accused of drug use, you get a fine. So I think you get like a $5,000 fine for having marijuana or selling it or whatever it is. And so what generally happens is that you get pretty close to 100% prosecution rate for these. So 90%, 95%, it's pretty high. People generally admit to being guilty. Now, some people don't. because some people are innocent and they didn't do anything wrong. Some people say they weren't and then they were guilty, but most of the time with drugs cases, they go to court. They either admit they're guilty and they get their fine, or they say they were innocent and they're found innocent or found not guilty. And that's usually what happens. That's in Australia because the crime is a fine and it's such a low level minor crime, you're not going to jail, that they don't care. Now, in other parts of the world, you have hefty prison sentences for drugs. Some cases you have your life imprisonment, or you even get executed. Now, in countries where the penalty is the same as it is for murder, the level of lying is also the same as it is for murder. And they might say, "Oh, they're accused fairly." Well, they're not. Here in Australia, we're accusing them fairly. We're only going to get a fine, so why bother lying? But for example, in Indonesia, where the penalty is the death penalty, you'll often find that they will set up people for false accusations. And in fact, some of the time they do it, they target tourists because they know that, they don't care if they kill a few tourists, executed them. And then it sort of makes it seem like they're under control, even though they're actually accepting bribes and all that to fuel the drug trade. So they do that. And the amount of lying that you'll see when you look at them is very, very high. Even in USA, where you can face 10 years jail for possession of drugs, it's quite a heavy penalty. Of course, here in Australia, prostitution is another one. That's legal. You don't go to jail for prostitution. There is such a thing as illegal prostitution, but it's rare. And most places it's perfectly legal. So you don't even get in trouble. You might get in trouble for not using a condom or something, but you don't get in trouble for actually doing it. And yet, let's say in USA, you go to jail for, I don't know, 10 years or something for it. So and I mean, there's parts of the world where it's illegal to be gay. You can face prison time for that, even execution in some places. So the level of penalty is the level of lying. If you went to someone in Australia right now and said, "Oh, you're gay," they'd either say, "Yes, I am," or "No, I'm not." There's no penalty either way. Maybe they won't tell you because they think it's invasive. But if you go to, let's say, I think Russia has a pretty big penalty for being gay. If you went up to someone in Russia and said, "Hey, you gay?" They're going to go, "No, no, 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 no," and they'll probably have a series of defences to protect it because they can go to jail for that. And so it really does vary depending on the penalty, not the crime. And I've often said that if you get a fine just for if murdering someone just got you a fine, probably more people would murder. But also, you'd probably find that when you get to penalising people, they'd be telling the truth a lot more. And also, of course, sexual assault and murder, if you're found guilty of either of them, and in sexual assault, it's actually worse for future employment than murder is, well, depending on the job, but generally, just being accused of that can often mean you're unemployable potentially for the rest of your life, at least for a lot of types of jobs. So it is a big deal, and there's a lot of incentive to lie about it, and that's why so many people do. And also, current laws, and I disagree with this, but current laws protect false accusations, at least here in Australia, and I think in most of the world. So, because they say, well, maybe the law got it wrong. So, if you make a completely fabricated accusation, sure, police will drop it, but you won't be charged. So, even the most extremely vengeful, hateful things, nothing happens. So, you've got free reign to do whatever you want. And I know there's men accusing, but it's also the criminal justice system does favour women, and it's 10 to 1. It's 10 to 1, 10 times as many men in prison as women. And if it was a fair justice system, it'd be 50-50. Now, the laws don't favour men or women, but the juries do. So once you get a jury trial in, they're going to favour women. And men accused more likely to be found guilty than a woman accused. Female victims more likely to believe than male victims, and so forth. So it's it's a very dangerous situation, and I really do think that the laws relating to sexual assault need to be reviewed so that they're fairer. Because at the moment, I think that it is a problem. And look, we'll see if he is guilty. Um, my suspicion is he's probably not, but I'm not. It's not like a 99% sure. It's like a probably like a 70. I'd say 70% chance he's not guilty. But that's with no evidence. So that might change. If you get sort of the hey dad guy level of evidence, I'll be going, oh, okay, well, no, he's guilty. And if you get even like the Puff Daddy thing, I'll be going, maybe. Again, I'm not convinced that Puff Daddy's guilty for sure. He might be. I'm 50-50 on that one. But yeah, it's there are people that were found guilty, which, to the evidence that I'm aware of, that was the wrong decision. But again, women, men, 10 times criminal justice thing. So you have that unfortunate part which plays out with this sort of cases more than anything else. And that inherently makes it unfair. In many ways, I think that perhaps one solution would be for these kind of things never to have a jury trial. Um, because I think that juries for this kind of case are inherently biased, and that's where the problem comes in. And you know, and I don't think it'd help if you had all male juries or anything like that. I think when there's a female accuser and a male accused of a sexual assault case, I think that juries can never be fair. And I think, you know, I really do think that, maybe judges won't be fair either, but at least they have a better chance. Maybe these things should be tried, you know, panel of judges, and the judges alone should decide, because at least the judges will understand the laws and hopefully won't be as biased as juries. Um, maybe that's a solution, but maybe if we could get lie detectors to be more accurate, that's a solution. But yeah, look, we'll see. And I don't want to say outright, oh no, they're definitely lying. They might be telling the truth. It's possible. Um, and it's not so impossible that it's 0% or 1%. It's but I just want to caution people before they say, oh, he's definitely guilty. Let's wait for the evidence and let's just take it into the account that just because he's been charged, all that means is that they have enough evidence that the police are not throwing it out. And in a case of celebrity, that threshold is a lot lower than it would be for someone who's not a celebrity. So, for someone who is not a celebrity, 40% of the cases that they bring forward are true. For someone who is a celebrity, it's 20%. So, him being charged means he's a 20% chance of being guilty or more. It could be more than that. It doesn't mean he's 100% guilty. Even if someone who was not a celebrity was charged, most of the time they're not guilty. Um, and so I really think that we need to take it with a grain of salt and say these people have a lot of reason to lie. They doesn't mean they are lying, but it means that they could be. We need to be careful, and I think just and I don't know if people are going around making things up about him, but just be very careful. This is a human being we're talking about, um, and I think that we need to be careful with this. Should be careful about anything when we accuse people of crimes, but really, uh, I'm not saying that Alan Jones is a nice guy. Alex Jones also in trouble with the law, but he's a different sort of person. Alex Jones is American. Alan Jones is Australian. I just think we should be careful, and I just think, before we just say, "Oh, he's definitely guilty," just realise that statistically speaking, most cases generally like this, they're not guilty, and at least until we've heard some of the specific evidence, I think we should hold that observation and be careful about what we say. Yeah, that's it for me. Bye now.